My name is Eloise Doyle, 32 years old. I spent a decade in the United States Army learning how to survive enemy fire. But no one trained me for the ambush in my own kitchen. I can still feel the cold tile against my cheek, the metallic tang of blood in my mouth from my brother-in-law, Richard's punch. Above me, my sister Claire, the same one who used to send me cookies in care packages, now stared down with empty eyes and delivered words sharper than shrapnel. You're just a burden in a uniform, Eloise. Dad's gone, Mom's useless. You think you're some kind of hero? In here, you're just a mistake that needs to be erased. They were forcing me to sign a paper that would steal my father's house. What they didn't know was that, through the pain, I'd activated the small recorder in my pocket. A soldier's habit when entering a hostile zone. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe the fiercest battles are sometimes fought not on a battlefield, but with the very people you're supposed to call family. The quiet in my father's house was a fragile thing. It lived in the smell of old wood and Murphy oil soap, and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. On leave, I'd found a strange peace in tackling the small things that were breaking down, one by one, since he'd been gone. Today's mission was the leaky faucet in the kitchen sink. Lying on my back on the linoleum floor, a heavy wrench in my hand, I felt a connection to him. This was his work, fixing things, making them whole. The steady drip, 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 into the plastic bucket beside my head was a rhythm I was determined to silence. From the corner of my eye, I could see my mother, Linda, hovering in the doorway. She wasn't watching me with pride or even curiosity. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her shoulders hunched. Her eyes, which used to be so full of life, were filled with a familiar, anxious dread. She knew something was coming. In this house, the silence was never peace. It was just the air holding its breath before a storm. The storm arrived when the back door slammed open with enough force to rattle the spice rack on the wall. My sister Claire and her husband Richard stormed in, bringing a cold November wind with them. Their faces were grim, etched with a fury that felt aimed, personal. Richard, a smarmy car salesman who always looked like his cheap suit was one size too small, marched to the center of the room. He threw a crumpled off-white envelope onto the oak kitchen table my father had built. It landed with a slap that echoed louder than a gunshot in the quiet house. "Here's the legacy your father left you," he snarled, the words dripping with contempt. I slowly slid out from under the sink, wiping grease from my hands onto an old rag. I could feel my mother shrink back into the shadows of the hallway. I picked up the envelope. The return address was a bank in downtown Pittsburgh. Inside, printed in stark, unforgiving red ink, were the words, "Final notice of foreclosure." It gave us 30 days. 30 days to pay a sum of money so large it didn't seem real. Or the home I grew up in, the home my father had poured his life into, would be sold at auction. Before I could even process the number, Claire's voice, high and sharp, sliced through my shock. "This is all your fault," she shrieked, her face contorting in a mask of fear and rage. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "All of it," I stared at her, completely bewildered. "Claire, what are you talking about?" "Don't you play dumb with me, Eloise." Her voice cracked. "If you hadn't run off to join the army to escape your responsibilities, if you'd stayed home and gotten a real job, we wouldn't be in this mess. You go off playing soldier all over the world while I'm stuck here, cleaning up this garbage. What good is your salary against the kind of debt Dad left us in?" The accusation was so absurd, so twisted, it knocked the wind out of me. Playing soldier? I had spent the last 10 years deploying to dusty, dangerous corners of the world, managing logistics in places where a single mistake could cost lives, all while sending a portion of my paycheck home every single month. Richard slid up next to her, placing a proprietary arm around her shoulder. His voice was smooth, slick with a false sympathy that was more poisonous than Claire's raw anger. "That's right, honey," he cooed, looking at me. "Eloise is used to the government taking care of her. She doesn't understand how the real world works. We have to save ourselves." He gestured to the foreclosure notice as if it were my report card. Then he produced another set of documents from his briefcase, clean, crisp, and predatory. We have a solution, he said, his salesman's smile finally appearing. A reverse mortgage. You sign this, it puts the house under our control. It gives us the capital we need to leverage, to get out of this hole. We'll handle everything. They weren't asking. They were telling. They wanted me to sign away my father's legacy to fix a problem I didn't create. My training kicked in. When faced with a crisis, you assess the data. I picked up the foreclosure notice again, my eyes scanning the fine print, the dates, the interest rates. My brain, trained to spot discrepancies in supply chains and inventory reports, immediately saw the flaws. The primary loans listed weren't from my father's time. They were recent, taken out in the last 2 years. The accrued interest was astronomical. This wasn't the modest mortgage of a retired Navy Seabee. This was the wreckage of reckless gambling, of stupid investments, and a lifestyle funded by debt. It was Richard's debt. I put the paper down on the table, my hand steady. I looked from the notice to Richard's smug face, then to my sister's desperate one. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it had the weight of a command. Claire flinched. Richard's smile faltered. What did you say? I said no, I repeated, my voice colder now, harder. This is Dad's house. I won't let you turn it into your personal casino to pay off your bad bets. That single word was the match hitting the gasoline. Richard's face turned a blotchy red. The mask of the concerned brother-in-law evaporated, revealing the petty tyrant underneath. He took a step toward me, puffing out his chest. You don't get a choice here, you arrogant little soldier. I reached for the foreclosure notice, my intention simple: to hold the proof, to confront them with the facts. Let me see that again. But Richard was faster. He snatched the paper away, his movement violent and sudden. You'll sign, he roared, and then he shoved me. Hard. I stumbled backward, my hips slamming into the edge of the kitchen counter. A jar of oregano fell, shattering on the floor and filling the air with a sweet, herby scent that was sickeningly out of place. I looked toward the door, but Claire had moved to block it, her arms crossed. Her face was a blank wall. The kitchen, my childhood sanctuary, had just become a trap. My soldier's instincts, honed over a decade of situational awareness training, took over. My hand moved, not in aggression, but in self-preservation. It slipped into the side pocket of my canvas jacket, my fingers brushing against the cool, hard plastic of the miniature audio recorder I always carried. A habit. In a hostile zone, you document everything. Richard saw the movement, and in his rage, he misinterpreted it completely. Oh, what's that? He sneered, a cruel, triumphant grin spreading across his face. Gonna call in your squad? Gonna call your little army buddies to come save you? He didn't wait for an answer. He lunged forward, his fist a blur of motion. My world exploded in a flash of white and pain. The first punch had landed. The ambush had begun. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the sterile quiet of the emergency room. Beep. 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 It was a cold, mechanical pulse, a stark contrast to the chaos still raging inside my head. I sat on the edge of the stiff hospital bed, the paper gown crinkling with every small movement. The throbbing in my jaw was a dull, constant ache, a physical reminder of the impact. A kind-faced nurse with tired eyes gently dabbed a cool cloth on a cut above my eyebrow. You've got a hairline fracture in one rib and a dislocated jaw, she said, her voice soft with practiced sympathy. You're very lucky. I just nodded, the movement sending a fresh jolt of pain up the side of my face. Lucky. The word felt wrong. I'd survived 2 deployments in Afghanistan, where IEDs were a daily threat and the danger was a tangible thing you could almost taste in the air. I had felt safer there, surrounded by my unit, than I had in my own father's kitchen. Here, in the one place I was supposed to be safe, I had never felt more vulnerable. A man in a rumpled suit stepped into the small cubicle, pulling the curtain shut behind him. He was older, with graying hair and a weary look that said he'd seen too much of what people do to each other. He introduced himself as Detective Miller. His eyes held a mix of professional gravity and a certain respect when he looked at me. He wasn't looking at a victim, he was looking at a soldier. Sergeant Doyle, he began, his voice a low baritone. I need you to walk me through it. From the beginning. He paused, then his eyes met mine with a piercing clarity. When did all this really start? His question wasn't just about the assault. It was a key. Turning the lock on a door in my mind I had sealed shut for a decade. The memories didn't just come back. They flooded in, pulling me under. The fluorescent lights of the hospital faded, replaced by the dim lighting of a military recruitment center in downtown Pittsburgh. It was 10 years ago. My father, David Doyle, stood beside me, his back ramrod straight. He was a former Navy Seabee, a builder, a man who believed that service and hard work were the cornerstones of a good life. There were tears welling in his eyes, shimmering with a pride so intense it felt like a physical force. You're carrying on a proud tradition, Eloise, he'd said, his voice thick with emotion as he hugged me. Remember what I always told you. A strong structure starts with a solid foundation. But next to him, my sister Claire stood with a different expression. I remember it so clearly now. The slight roll of her eyes as Dad embraced me, the way her lips thinned into a tight line. She leaned over to her new boyfriend, Richard, and whispered a bitter little comment, just loud enough for me to hear over the officer's congratulations. Look at that. Dad's golden girl. Always has to be the center of the universe. At the time, I dismissed it. I told myself it was just a fleeting moment of sisterly jealousy, a passing shadow. But sitting here, tasting the blood in my mouth, I finally understood. That wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a scratch. It was the first crack in our family's foundation. 2 years after I enlisted, that foundation crumbled. My father died in a scaffolding accident at a construction site. 1 minute he was there, the solid, unshakable pillar of our lives, and the next, he was gone. His death took the last of the light from our house, leaving my mother a ghost in her own home and Claire adrift in a sea of grief and financial worry. I flew home from my base on emergency leave. The funeral was a somber affair, the house filled with the quiet murmurings of friends and neighbors. I stood by the door in my dress blues, the uniform crisp and immaculate, accepting condolences from a long line of my father's old Navy buddies, men who understood the oath I'd taken, the life I had chosen. They shook my hand, looked me in the eye, and told me how proud my father had been. Later, needing a moment of quiet, I stepped into the kitchen, and that's when I overheard it. Claire was crying softly at the table, and Richard was beside her, his voice low and conspiratorial, a venomous whisper in the house of mourning. Stop crying, honey, he said, stroking her hair. Tears don't pay the bills. He glanced around the kitchen, his eyes assessing it not as a home, but as an asset. At least this house is worth something. We need to think about our future. We can't let her patriotism get in the way of that. The blood ran cold in my veins. He wasn't comforting my grieving sister. He was recruiting her. He was planting a seed of greed in the fertile soil of her resentment, turning her pain into his opportunity. He was pointing her to a new enemy. Me. The beeping of the heart monitor brought me back to the harsh reality of the emergency room. I looked up at Detective Miller, his patient, waiting face a stark contrast to the treacherous memories. My own voice, when it came out, was a raw, hoarse whisper. It didn't start tonight, Detective, I said, the bitter truth finally forming into words. It started the moment my sister decided my sacrifice was her burden. It started the day she decided her husband's greed was more important than our blood. The attack in the kitchen wasn't the beginning of the war. It was just the final, inevitable battle in a psychological campaign that Richard had been waging for a decade. He'd taken Claire's insecurity, her lifelong feeling of being second best, and he'd weaponized it. He'd fanned the small flame of her jealousy until it became an inferno of resentment. And for the first time, looking back, I wasn't just seeing the pain. I was seeing the enemy's battle plans, clear as day. If you've ever had a moment where you realized a family member's jealousy was deeper and more dangerous than you ever imagined, hit that like button. And in the comments below, just type the word foundation. if you believe that the cracks in a family often start long before the house actually falls. After I was discharged from the hospital and gave my initial statement to Detective Miller, going back to my father's house wasn't an option. It wasn't home anymore. It was a crime scene, a battlefield haunted by the ghosts of betrayal. A temporary restraining order was in place, a flimsy paper shield against Richard and Claire, but the real walls were the ones I was building inside myself. With the little savings I had, I found a new place to live. My new forward operating base was a shoebox studio apartment on the south side of Pittsburgh. The listing had called it cozy, which was real estate code for claustrophobic. The room was just big enough for a fold-out couch that doubled as my bed, a small card table, and a single window that looked out onto a solid brick wall. The sweet smell of freshly cut grass from my father's suburban lawn was replaced by the damp, musty scent of old brick and the constant soundtrack of city life. The wail of distant sirens, the rumble of trucks, the angry shouts from the street below. This was my new reality, a lonely outpost in the middle of a concrete jungle. At night, the silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that left too much room for thoughts to echo. My meals consisted of instant ramen noodles or the leftover MREs, meals ready to eat. I still had from my last field exercise. The same foil-packed dinners I'd shared with my squad under the stars in Afghanistan now felt like a bitter parody of camaraderie. I'd sit at the wobbly card table, eating beef stew out of a pouch, and the loneliness was so thick, so tangible, it felt like another person in the room with me. My life quickly fell into a grueling, relentless rhythm. I was fighting a war on two fronts now. The first front began at 0500 hours every morning. By day, I was Sergeant Doyle. I put on my uniform, a second skin of professionalism and duty, and drove to my logistics unit at the Army Reserve Center. I did my job with meticulous precision. I managed supply manifests, coordinated transportation, and briefed my superiors. I built a wall of competence around myself, so thick and so high that no one could see the cracks in the foundation. No one asked questions, and I offered no answers. But when I clocked out at 1700, the second front began. I'd change out of my uniform into jeans and a t-shirt and drive to a noisy sports bar downtown, where I'd taken a job bussing tables and washing dishes until 2 a.m. The work was exhausting and anonymous. I'd haul heavy tubs of dirty glasses, the smell of stale beer and fried food clinging to my clothes, my mind blessedly numb from the physical labor. The extra cash was a necessity, a war chest I was building to pay for the legal fight that was coming. There were nights I'd get back to my apartment and fall onto the lumpy couch, my back screaming in protest, and manage only 3 hours of sleep before the alarm blared again. But I never missed my 5 a.m. run. I would lace up my running shoes and pound the pavement along the Monongahela River, the cold Pittsburgh air burning my lungs. During those runs, a mantra from basic training would play on a loop in my head. Pain is weakness leaving the body. Pain is weakness leaving the body. I clung to that discipline like a life raft. It was the only thing I had left that made sense, the only structure in a life that had been blown to pieces. One evening, after a particularly brutal shift at the bar, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a single word, Mom. My heart hammered against my ribs. A tiny, foolish flicker of hope ignited in the darkness. Maybe she'd come to her senses. Maybe she'd finally chosen her daughter. I stepped out into the alley behind the bar, the noise of the city fading behind me. Hello, I answered, my voice cautious. Eloise. My mother's voice was a fragile, tear-soaked whisper. The hope in my chest withered and died. Eloise, I'm so sorry. Sorry for what, Mom? I asked, my voice flat. There was a long pause, filled with her shaky breaths. I could almost hear the battle raging within her, the love for her daughter fighting a losing war against her fear. Fear won. Claire says you shouldn't make such a big deal out of this, she finally stammered. The words were a gut punch, delivered by the last person I ever thought would betray me. Richard. He promised he'll take care of me. He said he'll make sure I'm safe. She wasn't calling to see if I was okay. She wasn't asking if I was in pain. if I was scared. She was calling to ask me to surrender, to lay down my arms for the sake of her false peace, a peace bought and paid for by Richard's lies. "You're strong, Eloise," she added, her voice pleading. "You can take care of yourself, can't you? You've always been the strong one." I felt something inside me turn to ice. It was the final confirmation. I was utterly, completely alone. "Yes, Mom," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel. "I always have." I ended the call and stood there in the darkness, the phone feeling like a dead weight in my hand. Weeks later, exhausted to the bone and running on fumes, I found myself in a 24-hour diner after my bar shift. I couldn't face the crushing emptiness of my apartment. I was nursing a cup of burnt coffee, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, when I stumbled upon a video on YouTube. The thumbnail showed a man's silhouette against a stark black background. I pressed play. A man's voice, deep and gravelly, filled the small space around me. It was raw, unflinching, and devoid of any pity. "There is no one coming to save you," the voice boomed. "No cavalry. You have to take extreme ownership. Get up, dust off, reload, re-engage, and go out on the attack." The man was Jocko Willink, a retired Navy SEAL. His words weren't comforting. They weren't a gentle hand on the shoulder. They were a boot kicking me out of my self-pity. They were a direct order that spoke to the soldier still inside me. His message didn't heal my wounds, but it did something more important. It reloaded my will to fight. Jocko Willink's voice became the soundtrack to my early morning runs. His podcast on extreme ownership was my new field manual. Every day as I ran along the river, his words echoed in my head. "You are in charge of your own world. Take ownership." I realized that waiting for my mother to stand up for me, or for Claire to see the truth, was a losing strategy. It was a waste of emotional resources. My mission was no longer to understand their betrayal, but to defeat it. Jocko often talked about leaning on your team, on the people in the trenches with you. My team had always been my unit in the army, but this was a different kind of war, fought on home soil. I needed a different kind of support. So, I decided to do something I'd been avoiding for years. I looked up the address of the local Veterans of Foreign Wars Post, VFW Post 707. Walking up to the old brick building felt like reporting for duty at a new, unfamiliar base. My stomach was a knot of anxiety. I'd spent my entire career in a male-dominated field, but this felt different. I was afraid of being judged, of being seen as weak, of bringing my messy personal war into a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, old wood, and something vaguely like beer from the night before. It was dim, the only light coming from a few low-hanging lamps over a pool table and the glow of a TV in the corner showing a news report on mute. A handful of veterans were scattered around a large circular table, their ages spanning generations. There were older men with Vietnam veteran hats, their faces etched with the kind of history you can't read in books, sitting next to younger guys in their 30s with the sharp, watchful eyes of those recently returned from Iraq or Afghanistan. When I stepped in, the conversation lulled. A few of them looked up, giving me a quiet, assessing nod before turning back to their coffee. I felt like an outsider, an intruder. I almost turned and walked out, but then a voice cut through my uncertainty. "Coffee's fresh, help yourself." The man who spoke was old enough to be my grandfather, with a kind wrinkled face and a prosthetic arm resting on the table. Pinned to his worn-out vest was a Master Gunnery Sergeant insignia from the Marine Corps. Everyone just called him Gunny. I poured myself a mug of the strong black coffee and took an empty seat at the table. For a while, I just listened. They talked about everything and nothing. The Steelers' chances this season, the rising price of gas, a buddy who was in the VA hospital. But underneath the casual conversation, there was an unspoken language, a shared understanding that you only earn through service. Gunny's eyes eventually landed on the 101st Airborne Division patch on the sleeve of my jacket. "Where'd you serve, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Afghanistan, Gunny. Logistical support out of Bagram," I replied. And just like that, the conversation started. For the first time in months, I felt like I was speaking the same language as the people around me. The language of acronyms, of shared hardship, of the strange, dark humor that gets you through the impossible. I went back the next week, and the week after that. I started to feel less like a visitor and more like a member of the post. Then, one evening, during a smaller, informal support meeting in a back room, I found the courage to speak. I told them my story. I didn't cry or get overly emotional. I laid it out like a mission briefing, sticking to the facts, the timeline, the objective evidence. I reported the events of that day in the kitchen with the same detached clarity I would use to report an enemy engagement. The room was completely silent when I finished. No one offered me pity. No one looked at me like I was broken. They just looked at me with a profound, unwavering understanding. Then a woman named Maria, a Marine veteran who'd lost her leg in Fallujah, wheeled herself closer to me. She had the toughest, most resilient eyes I'd ever seen. She reached out and put a firm hand on my shoulder. "Welcome home, soldier," she said, her voice steady and strong. "This is your home now." And that was it. The dam I had so carefully constructed inside of me finally broke. Tears I didn't even know I'd been holding back streamed down my face. I wasn't crying out of sadness or self-pity. I was crying out of sheer, overwhelming relief. The relief of being seen. The relief of being understood. The relief of, after so long, finally feeling like I was home. But this group, my new unit, they didn't just offer words. They offered a plan of action. Gunny, who had spent 20 years as a criminal investigator in the Corps after his time in Vietnam, leaned forward. "I'll take a look at those police reports for you," he said grimly. "See if they missed anything." Maria, who now worked as a paralegal, pulled out her phone. "I know a lawyer," she said. "A bulldog. She specializes in domestic abuse cases and veterans' rights. She'll tear this guy apart on the stand." Another vet, a young Air Force tech sergeant who was an expert in IT, spoke up from the back. "That recorder you mentioned," he said. "If the file is damaged, I might be able to recover it. I can make secure copies, build a chain of custody." Suddenly, I wasn't a lone soldier fighting a hopeless battle anymore. I was part of a team. A highly specialized, deeply motivated fire team that had my back. I looked around the room at these faces, these strangers who had become my family, and felt a surge of strength I hadn't felt in years. Gunny gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze, his grip surprisingly strong. He looked at me, the commander assessing his soldier, getting ready to issue the next order. "All right, Sergeant," he said, his voice low and serious. "You've got your unit assembled. Now, tell us. What's the next objective?" For the first time since the ambush, I felt like I had solid ground under my feet. The war had shifted from a chaotic scramble for survival to a structured, strategic campaign. My new command center was the conference room of a downtown law firm, and my new commanding officer was Evelyn Reed. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes that didn't miss a thing and a demeanor that radiated controlled power. Maria hadn't been kidding when she called her a bulldog. Gunny sat beside me at the polished mahogany table, his posture as straight as if he were in a formal review. We were listening to the evidence. The tech sergeant from the VFW had worked his magic, and the audio file from my little recorder was now crystal clear. We listened in silence as the ugly scene replayed through a small speaker. Richard's threats, Claire's venomous words, "You're just a mistake that needs to be erased," filled the quiet, professional space. Hearing it again, removed from the pain and shock of the moment, made it even more chilling. It was calculated. It was cruel. Evelyn Reed steepled her fingers, her expression unreadable. "This is good," she said, her voice calm and clipped. "This establishes intent and malice. It corroborates your statement perfectly." Just as she spoke, my phone, sitting face down on the table, began to vibrate. The low hum was an intrusion, a foreign sound in our sterile war room. I glanced at the screen. The name displayed was Mom. My heart seized. A cold dread washed over me, instantly dissolving the confidence I'd felt just moments before. Gunny saw the look on my face and gave me a questioning glance. I held up a hand, signaling for him to wait, and muted the speaker. With a deep breath, I tried to steady my voice, pushing down the sudden wave of anxiety. "Mom," I answered, trying to sound calm. But the voice that answered wasn't my mother's. It was Claire's, and it was coated in a layer of sickly sweet concern. "Eloise, thank God you answered. Mom is right here with me." I could hear my mother sniffling softly in the background, a sound designed to be heard. "She's not doing so well, Eloise. This whole thing, it's just killing her." It was a trap. A perfectly engineered psychological ambush, and I had walked right into it. "Her blood pressure is through the roof," Claire went on, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "She cried all night. She can't eat. The doctor says the stress you're putting on her is dangerous. She's an old woman, Eloise. Can't you see what you're doing to her?" Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to hit me where I was most vulnerable. The guilt. The ingrained sense of duty to protect my mother. Before I could respond, the phone was passed. "Eloise." It was Richard. His voice was oozing a fake, remorseful tone that made my skin crawl. "Listen, I know I was wrong. I was under a lot of pressure and I lost my temper. I'm so sorry for what happened, but we're family. You can't take your own brother to court. Think of your mother. Just drop the lawsuit. We can work this out, just the three of us. I promise I'll even cut you in on a piece. We'll make it right." The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. He was offering me a bribe, a pathetic scrap from the table, after assaulting me and trying to steal my home. It wasn't an apology. It was an insult, a confirmation that he thought I was just as greedy and transactional as he was. I remained silent, the rage and disgust rendering me speechless. My silence was his cue to pass the phone back to his primary weapon. The sweetness in Claire's voice vanished, replaced by the familiar, sharp-edged steel. "Are you happy now? Are you hearing this?" she hissed into the phone. "You're destroying our mother. Do you understand me? She's going to lose everything because of your selfishness. Is this what they teach you in the army? That your precious imaginary honor is more important than family? Dad would be so ashamed of you." Her words were poison-tipped needles, jabbing at every insecurity, every deep-seated fear I had. For a split second, I faltered. The room began to feel small, the air thick. Was she right? Was I the monster in this story? Was my fight for justice just a selfish crusade that would leave my mother as collateral damage? My eyes darted around the room, searching for an anchor. I saw Evelyn Reed, watching me with a steady, unblinking gaze. She wasn't judging me. She was assessing me, waiting to see if her client would hold the line. Then I looked at Gunny. He wasn't looking at me with pity. He met my gaze and gave me a single, firm nod. It wasn't a command, it was a statement. "I'm with you. We're with you. Hold fast." That silent gesture of support was all I needed. I took a deep, steadying breath, borrowing their strength, their conviction. The fog of guilt began to clear. "You lost the right to call me family the night you stood by and watched your husband beat me, Claire," I said, my voice coming out colder and clearer than I thought possible. Every trace of warmth was gone, replaced by the hard finality of a closed door. There was a stunned silence on the other end. "And you, Richard," I continued, my voice dropping even lower. "Don't you ever call me your sister again. We have nothing left to talk about. I'll see you in court." I could hear him grab the phone, his breathing heavy and ragged. The mask was completely gone now. "You'll regret this, you little bitch," he spat, his voice a low, menacing growl. Then the line went dead. I lowered the phone, my hand trembling slightly, but my resolve was like iron. The conference room was silent for a long moment. Evelyn Reed broke the silence, a grim, satisfied smile touching her lips. "Okay," she said, leaning forward. "That confirms it. They know we have the recording. They're panicking." She looked from me to Gunny, her eyes sharp and focused. "A cornered animal is a dangerous one. They're going to get desperate. We need to move faster." A few days after the threatening phone call, an embossed invitation arrived at my apartment. It was for the town's annual Hometown Heroes fundraiser, a charity dinner organized by the local Chamber of Commerce to support military families. My first instinct was to throw it in the trash. The last thing I wanted was to parade around a room full of strangers. But Gunny saw it differently. We were at the VFW post, going over case files with Maria. "You have to go," he'd said, his voice firm. "Richard wants you to hide. He wants you isolated. You need to show them you're not running." Maria agreed. "It's a strategic move, Eloise. Be seen. Be composed. Let them see a soldier, not a victim." So I went. Gunny and Maria came with me, my chosen family flanking me as we walked into the banquet hall of the local country club. The moment we stepped inside, I knew it was a mistake. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a carefully prepared kill zone. Richard and Claire were standing near the entrance, greeting people like the town's royal couple. Claire was wearing a glittering cocktail dress, a fake, serene smile plastered on her face. Richard was in his element, shaking hands, clapping men on the back, his voice booming with false sincerity. A large banner hanging over the stage read, "A special thanks to our platinum sponsor, Richard Hale of Hale Auto Group." He hadn't just attended the event, he had bought it. He had turned a night meant to honor soldiers into a stage for his own grand performance. My stomach churned. We were on his turf, playing his game. We took our seats at a table near the back, and I tried to remain invisible, a gray rock in a sea of polite chatter. But I could feel their presence, a toxic energy radiating from the front of the room. I watched them work the crowd, Claire looking fragile and devoted, Richard looking like a pillar of the community. They were painting a picture, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I was about to be painted out of it. The climax of the evening arrived when the MC, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, invited Richard to the stage to say a few words. He strode to the podium, basking in the applause. He started with all the predictable cliches, his car salesman voice dripping with practiced patriotism. He spoke of sacrifice, of duty, of the brave men and women who serve our country. The crowd nodded along, captivated. Then his tone shifted. He leaned into the microphone, his expression becoming one of solemn, heartfelt concern. "But folks," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "we also have to remember that when our heroes come home, the battle isn't always over. Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones we can't see." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of his words settle over the silent room. "My own family," he continued, his voice thick with fake emotion, "is facing such a challenge right now. We are trying to support a beloved family member who is struggling to separate what's real from what's not, a side effect of the stresses of their service." He never said my name. He didn't have to. In a town this small, everyone knew. Every head in that room subtly turned, every pair of eyes shifted to my table. I could feel their stares like physical blows. I could hear the whispers spreading like a virus from table to table. PTSD, unstable, delusional. In the space of 30 seconds, he had publicly discredited me. He had taken my decade of service, my uniform, my honor, and twisted it into a weapon to be used against me, painting me as a damaged, unreliable veteran. I looked to the front row, and I saw my sister, Claire. She was looking down at her hands, shaking her head slowly with a pained, sorrowful expression, playing the role of the long-suffering sister to perfection. She was his accomplice, his co-conspirator in this public execution of my character. That was it. That was the last straw. Something inside me snapped. The years of quiet resentment, the disciplined silence, the soldier's creed of sucking it up and driving on, it all shattered. A tidal wave of pure, cold fury washed over me, so powerful it made my vision sharpen and the sounds of the room fade to a dull roar. Maria reached over and put a warning hand on my arm, but I gently shook my head. This was my battle. This was my front line. And I had to face it alone. I stood up. A hush fell over the room as I began to walk, not toward the exit, but toward the stage. My steps were measured, deliberate. Each footfall on the plush carpet was a declaration. I could see the panic flash in Richard's eyes as I approached. He tried to cut his speech short, to wave me off, but it was too late. I walked right past him, took the second microphone from its stand, and turned to face the stunned audience. My hands were steady. My voice, when it came out, was clear, strong, and carried the unshakable authority of a sergeant addressing her troops. "My name is Sergeant Eloise Doyle," I said, my voice ringing through the silent hall. "I am not delusional." I turned my head slightly and looked directly at Richard, who was frozen in a state of shock beside me. "The only wound I am suffering from was inflicted by this man when he punched me in the face in my own father's kitchen." Gasps rippled through the crowd. I then turned my gaze to the front row, locking eyes with my sister. "And by this woman," I said, my voice never wavering, "who stood by and watched it happen after telling me I was a mistake that needed to be erased." Finally, I turned back to the audience, to the whole town that was now my witness. "The truth isn't always easy to hear," I said, my voice resonating with a power I didn't know I possessed. "But it deserves to be heard." I paused, letting the weight of that statement land. "And I will not be silent anymore." If you have ever been pushed to your absolute breaking point and finally decided to speak your truth, hit that like button. And if you believe that a person's honor is the one thing no one has the right to attack, comment the word honor below. I placed the microphone back in its stand with a firm, definitive click. Then, with my head held high, I turned and walked out of that banquet hall, leaving a firestorm of chaos and an undeniable declaration of war in my wake. My dramatic exit from the fundraiser had, as Evelyn Reed put it, created a firestorm. The town was buzzing. My public declaration had shifted the battlefield. This was no longer a private family dispute, it was a public reckoning, and we were going to use that momentum. Evelyn's office became our tactical operations center. A large whiteboard, usually reserved for corporate litigation, was now covered in a web of names, dates, and timelines related to my case. It looked like a complex mission plan, and in many ways, it was. I sat at the head of the conference table with my unit: Evelyn, our commanding officer; Gunny, our intelligence chief; and Maria, our legal specialist. The mood was sober, focused, and utterly determined. "Your performance was unorthodox, Sergeant," Evelyn said, a rare, approving glint in her sharp eyes. "But effective. You took away his narrative. Now, we press the advantage." The strategy for the upcoming hearing was laid out with military precision. Maria would handle the legal filings, ensuring every document was airtight. Gunny was tasked with tracking down and prepping potential witnesses. My role was the most difficult. I was the primary witness, the soldier on the front line who would have to endure the enemy's cross-examination. Evelyn spent hours grilling me, preparing me for the cheap shots and psychological tactics Richard's lawyer would undoubtedly use. She was tough, relentless, and exactly what I needed. During one of our strategy sessions, Gunny arrived carrying a thick manila folder. He dropped it on the table with a heavy, satisfying thud. It was the result of weeks of his quiet, meticulous digging. "Richard Hale is no amateur," Gunny said, his voice low and grim. He opened the folder, revealing pages of documents, public records, and handwritten notes. "Long before he met your sister, he had a pattern. A history of charming his way into the lives of vulnerable women and borrowing their money. He had found 2 other women, both widows in their late 60s from a neighboring county. The stories were sickeningly similar. Richard had swooped in, offering financial advice and promising safe, high-return investments. Both women had lost their life savings to his schemes. But the real bombshell, the secret weapon we didn't know we had, was buried deeper in the file." Gunny slid a bank statement across the table. It was my mother's. "This is the real source of the foreclosure, Eloise," he said quietly. "It wasn't your father's debt. Richard convinced your mother, Linda, to withdraw her entire retirement savings, everything your father left her, and invested in a shell corporation he set up, a ghost company. The money vanished, and he used the house as collateral to cover his other failing investments. It all clicked into place. The foreclosure notice wasn't just the result of Claire's complicity, it was the final move in Richard's long con. He hadn't just been manipulating my sister's emotions. He had been systematically robbing my mother blind. He wasn't just trying to take our home, he was trying to erase the evidence of his crimes. The assault in the kitchen wasn't just an act of rage, it was an act of pure desperation from a cornered predator. The days leading up to the hearing were a blur of preparation and anxiety. I kept myself busy, focusing on the mission, pushing down the fear. Then, one afternoon, a plain white envelope with no return address appeared in my mailbox. My name and address were written in a shaky, familiar script. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside, there was no letter, only a faded photograph. It was of Claire and me as kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old, grinning on the old oak swing set our dad had built in the backyard. Tucked behind the photo was a small folded piece of notepaper. On it were 5 words, written in my mother's unsteady hand. "Don't give up, she's in there somewhere." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a promise to testify. It was just a signal. A tiny flickering candle in the suffocating darkness of her fear. It was a small belated act of rebellion from a woman I thought I had lost completely. I stared at the picture of 2 smiling sisters, a lifetime ago, and a wave of profound sadness washed over me. I carefully put the photo and the note away. It was both a painful reminder of what I had lost and a powerful confirmation of what I was fighting for. I wasn't just fighting for a house. I was fighting for the memory of a family that had once existed and for the father who had built its foundation. The day of the hearing arrived. It was a cold, gray Pittsburgh morning. I chose my clothes like a uniform. A simple navy blue blazer, gray slacks, and a white blouse. It was armor, conservative, professional, and unremarkable. But while the clothes were civilian, my posture was pure military. Shoulders back, head up, eyes forward. Gunny and Maria met me at the courthouse entrance. They didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me it would be okay. They were soldiers. They knew you don't make promises about the outcome of a battle. Instead, Maria simply gave my hand a firm squeeze. "We're right behind you," she said. Gunny pulled me into a brief, solid hug. He smelled of Old Spice and coffee. "Standard recon mission, Sergeant," he whispered in my ear, his voice the steady, calming rumble of a seasoned commander. "Stay calm, gather intel, execute the objective." I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, and nodded. Hooah! They couldn't come inside with me. I had to face this part alone. But as I turned and walked toward the heavy, ornate wooden doors of the courtroom, I knew that wasn't true. I was walking in by myself, but I was carrying the strength of my entire unit with me. The final battle was about to begin. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, all polished wood and somber silence. I sat beside Evelyn Reed at the plaintiff's table, my back straight, my hands clasped loosely in my lap. Across the aisle, Richard and Claire sat with their lawyer. They looked the part of the respectable, wronged couple. Richard in a well-tailored suit, Claire in a conservative dress, her face a mask of weary innocence. They were playing for the judge, and for a moment, a sliver of fear pierced through my composure. What if it worked? Richard's lawyer, a slick man named Peterson with a plastic smile and predatory eyes, began his offensive. He called me to the stand. His strategy was exactly what Evelyn had predicted: death by 1,000 cuts. He didn't yell or accuse. His weapon was condescension. "Sergeant Doyle," he began, his voice dripping with false respect. "Your military record is commendable. But it's fair to say you've served in high-stress, confrontational environments, correct?" "Yes, sir," I answered, my voice even. "And these experiences," he continued, pacing slowly, "can sometimes make it difficult to adjust to civilian life. Can they perhaps make a person more sensitive to perceived threats and family disagreements?" He was building his narrative, brick by brick. The unstable veteran, the unreliable narrator. I looked at the judge, then back at Peterson. "Sir, I was trained to handle stress," I said, my voice cold and clear. "I was not trained to be assaulted in my own home." Peterson's smile tightened, but he wasn't done. He tried to twist my actions, my words, my very service into a pathology. But I held my ground, just as Evelyn had drilled me. I answered every question with short, factual statements. I was a soldier reporting the facts, and his insinuations couldn't penetrate my armor of discipline. When he was finished, it was Evelyn's turn. She rose with a quiet confidence that filled the room. "Your Honor," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "The defense has attempted to paint a picture of my client as an aggressor, a soldier trained for violence. But let's consider the facts. Here we have a highly trained U.S. Army sergeant who allowed herself to be punched with enough force to dislocate her jaw without retaliating. Mr. Peterson, in your expert opinion, does that sound like a sign of aggression or of almost superhuman restraint?" Peterson sputtered, caught off guard. A ripple of murmurs went through the small audience. Evelyn had taken his own weapon and turned it against him. She wasn't just defending me, she was highlighting my honor. "Now, Your Honor," she continued smoothly, "we would like to present a piece of audio evidence." A court officer placed a small digital recorder on the judge's bench. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation. Evelyn pressed play. First, there was static. Then, my own voice, strained. "No, this is Dad's house." Then Richard's, booming with rage. "You don't get a choice here, you arrogant little soldier." The courtroom was dead silent. I chanced a glance at the defense table. Richard was rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Claire's face had gone pale, a ghostly white under the fluorescent lights. Then came her voice, cold and sharp as ice. "You're just a mistake that needs to be erased." A collective gasp went through the room. It was one thing to read accusations on paper. It was another to hear the raw, undisguised hatred in a sister's voice. The recording ended with Richard's final, snarled threat. "You'll regret this, you little bitch!" The silence that followed was deafening. The judge looked down from his bench, his expression grim. The mask Richard and Claire had so carefully constructed had just been shattered into a million pieces. The evidence was absolute. It was undeniable. But Evelyn wasn't finished. She was just getting started. "I call my next witness," she announced. "Mrs. Eleanor Vance." A frail, elderly woman with kind eyes and a trembling hand was sworn in. She was one of the widows Gunny had found. With gentle prompting from Evelyn, she told her story. A heartbreaking account of how the charming Mr. Hale had befriended her after her husband's death, convincing her to invest her entire life savings into a can't-miss real estate opportunity that had vanished without a trace. Her testimony painted a devastating picture of a predator who targeted the lonely and the vulnerable. Then, for the final, killing blow, Evelyn presented the bank records. She laid out the paper trail, clear and irrefutable, showing the transfer of my mother's retirement funds into Richard's shell corporation. She showed the subsequent loan defaults that had led to the foreclosure notice. She turned to the judge, her voice ringing with conviction. "Your Honor, this was never a simple family dispute over a house. This was the final act of a systematic pattern of predatory fraud. Mr. Hale targeted vulnerable women, including his own mother-in-law, and when his scheme was threatened by Sergeant Doyle, he resorted to violence to silence her. This isn't just an assault case, it's a case of calculated, cold-blooded theft." It was over. I knew it was over. I risked another look at my sister, and for the first time, I didn't see hatred in her eyes. I didn't see resentment or jealousy. I saw pure, unadulterated shock, a horrified, dawning awareness. She was staring at Richard, but she wasn't looking at her husband. She was looking at the monster from Mrs. Vance's story. She was looking at a con man, a liar, a thief who had just been unmasked in the harshest possible light. The man she had defended, the man she had sacrificed her own sister for, was a complete stranger. The judge's voice cut through my thoughts. He granted the permanent restraining order. But he went further. Citing the overwhelming evidence of fraud, he ordered a full criminal investigation into all of Richard Hale's financial activities. Richard slumped in his chair as if his strings had been cut, his face a mask of disbelief. But I barely noticed him. My eyes were locked on Claire. She sat perfectly still, frozen in her chair, as her entire world, the entire life she had built on a foundation of lies, collapsed into dust around her. The legal battle was won. But looking at my sister's shattered expression, I knew the aftershocks were just beginning. I walked back into my father's house the day after the hearing. The police tape was gone, the legal storm had passed. With Richard facing a host of criminal charges and a permanent restraining order keeping him miles away, the house was finally safe. But it wasn't peaceful. It was just quiet. An unnervingly hollow quiet, filled with the ghosts of what used to be. I wandered through the rooms, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. I ran my hand over the back of my father's worn leather armchair, touched the frame of a photo of my parents on their wedding day. Victory didn't feel like the triumphant celebration I had imagined. There was no surge of elation, no fist pump of success. There was only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, the kind a soldier feels after a decade-long deployment finally comes to an end. You're home, you're safe, but you're so depleted, you don't know what to do next. I ended up in the kitchen, the place where the war had officially begun. It was clean now, sterile. The spot where my head had hit the tile was just a spot on the floor. I pulled out a chair from the oak table and sat down, the silence pressing in on me. And for the first time in months, with no battle left to fight and no enemy left to face, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not for the pain or the betrayal, but for the sheer, crushing weight of it all. A few days later, a package arrived. It was a cardboard box with my mother's shaky handwriting on it. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were small treasures from my childhood she had kept. My first pair of ballet slippers, a dusty softball trophy, a collection of seashells from a long-forgotten family vacation. Underneath it all was a long, multi-page letter. I sat at the kitchen table and read it, my heart a tight, aching knot in my chest. She wrote about her crippling loneliness after Dad died, how the silence in the house had been a physical weight on her. She described how Richard had entered their lives like a charming savior, slowly and methodically taking control. First of their finances, then of their minds. He preyed on her fear, convincing her that she and Claire were helpless without him, that I was a distant, uncaring stranger. She admitted her own weakness, her own cowardice. She wrote about the terror that had paralyzed her, making her blind to his manipulations and deaf to her own conscience. She didn't try to excuse her actions. She only tried to explain them. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Eloise," she wrote at the end, the ink slightly smeared as if by a tear. "I don't deserve it. I only hope that someday you can understand that I loved you in the only way I knew how, as broken as it was." The letter didn't erase the pain. It didn't absolve her of her betrayal. But it did fill in some of the empty spaces, giving a tragic shape to what had felt like senseless cruelty. It didn't make me forgive her, but it allowed me to see her not as a monster, but as a casualty of a war she was never equipped to fight. The call from Claire came a week later, just once. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual sharp edge. She asked to meet at a neutral location, a small roadside coffee shop halfway between the house and the city. When I saw her sitting in a booth by the window, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked like she had aged 10 years in 10 days. Her eyes were sunken and hollow, the fight completely gone out of her. We sat in silence for a long time, the clatter of cups and the murmur of other conversations filling the space between us. There were no tearful apologies, no dramatic pleas for forgiveness. She just looked down at her hands, wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. "You were right," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "About him. You were right about everything." She looked up, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the sister I once knew in her tired eyes. "He poisoned my mind, Eloise. I let him. I let him turn my own jealousy into a weapon against you because it was easier than facing how I really felt." I just listened, letting her words hang in the air. There was nothing for me to say. "I'm leaving town," she continued, her gaze dropping back to the table. "Going to stay with a cousin in Ohio for a while. Start over, I guess. I needed to say that." She finally looked at me one last time. "Good luck, Eloise." It wasn't a reconciliation. It was a surrender. It was the quiet, sad acknowledgement of a bond that had been irrevocably broken. "You too, Claire," I replied softly. We sat for another minute in that shared, heavy silence. Then, as if by some unspoken signal, We both stood up. We walked out of the coffee shop and went in opposite directions, without a hug, without a backward glance, without a single promise to stay in touch. Our relationship, like a casualty of war, was over. Back at the house, I felt a restless energy, a need to do something, to fix something. I walked out into the backyard. The old oak swing set my father had built for us when we were kids stood in the corner of the yard, a monument to a happier time. The wood was gray and splintered, one of the chains rusted through, the seat hanging crookedly. It was broken, just like us. I stood there for a long time, just looking at it. Then I turned and walked to the old shed in the back of the garage. I pulled the heavy door open, and the familiar smell of sawdust and oil filled the air. My father's tools hung in their designated places on the pegboard, just as he'd left them, now covered in a fine layer of dust. I took down his old hammer, his saw, his sander. I wiped the dust from each one, the weight of the tools feeling solid and familiar in my hands. I carried them out into the quiet afternoon and set them down on the grass beside the broken swing. The air was cool, the sun was beginning to set, and the sound of a distant lawnmower was the only thing that broke the silence. I wasn't just fixing a swing set. I was starting the long, slow work of rebuilding a life. I was starting with the wreckage, just as my father, the old Navy Seabee, had always taught me to do. A year can change everything. A year ago, my father's house was a cold, silent crime scene. Today, it's a home. The quiet that once felt so heavy and hollow is now filled with warmth and the low murmur of life. The old oak swing set I painstakingly rebuilt now stands proudly in the backyard, painted a deep, dignified olive drab, army green. It's a reminder not of what was broken, but of what can be made whole again. I sold the tiny studio apartment in the city and moved back in for good. I had won back the house in court, but it was over the last 12 months that I truly reclaimed the feeling of home. On any given Saturday, you can find Gunny, Maria, and a few of our friends from the VFW post gathered around a grill in the backyard. The air thick with the smell of barbecue and the sound of laughter and old war stories. They are my family now. The real and true version of the word. A unit forged not by blood, but by shared loyalty and mutual respect. I'm no longer living in the past, haunted by ghosts. I'm building a future, right here on the solid foundation my father left behind. The settlement from the lawsuit against Richard was substantial. After he was convicted on multiple fraud charges, the court made sure of it. I had enough money to travel, to buy a new car, to do all the things a person is supposed to do after winning a hard-fought battle. But I did something else. With Evelyn Reed's legal guidance and a significant portion of the settlement funds, I established the Doyle Legacy Project. I decided that my father's true legacy wasn't a piece of property or a bank account. It was his unwavering spirit of service, his instinct to build and protect. My project, operating out of a small office we built in the back of the VFW post, was designed to do just that. We set up a 24/7 confidential hotline, offered free counseling sessions, and provided initial legal aid to any service member or veteran who felt trapped, silenced, or attacked in what was supposed to be the safest place of all, their own home. We were building a new kind of forward operating base, a safe harbor for soldiers fighting the hidden war at home. The day we officially launched the project, the main hall of the VFW was packed. The whole community had turned out. Veterans, local business owners, even the mayor. When I stepped up to the podium, I didn't feel like a victim telling her sad story. I felt like a commander addressing her new platoon. I told them my story, not for sympathy, but as a testament to survival. I used to think my toughest battles were fought in faraway countries, wearing this uniform, I said, my voice clear and steady. But I learned that the most dangerous enemy can be the one who shares your roof and your last name. I learned that the silence that is meant to protect a family's reputation can become a prison. And I learned that our most powerful weapon isn't a rifle or a strategy. It's our own voice. I looked out at the faces in the crowd, and in the front row, I saw Gunny and Maria. Gunny gave me a proud, affirmative nod, and Maria was smiling, her eyes shining. I thought of the night I had sat alone and broken in a diner and the voice that had pulled me back from the brink. I took a breath and finished my speech with the words that had changed my life. "There is no one coming to save you," I said, my voice ringing with conviction. "There is no cavalry, but you. You can become the cavalry for someone else. And that is our new mission." The final scene of my story doesn't end with applause or a grand victory. It ends a few months later in the quiet of my small office at the VFW. The walls are covered with resource pamphlets and contact numbers. The coffee is always on. A young woman is sitting across the desk from me. She's an airman, barely in her 20s, her uniform immaculate, but her eyes red-rimmed and full of a pain I recognize all too well. She's telling me about her husband, about his controlling behavior, the verbal abuse, the way he uses her service as a weapon against her. When she's finished, her story hangs in the air between us, fragile and heavy. She looks down at her hands, her voice a near whisper. "I just feel so alone," she says, "like no one could possibly understand." I let the silence sit for a moment, giving her space to breathe. Then, I lean forward. I look directly into her eyes, and with all the strength, all the certainty, and all the empathy I've earned through my own trial by fire, I give her the words I once would have given anything to hear. "I understand," I say softly. "You are not alone." I offer her a small, steady smile. "Welcome home, soldier." A single tear rolls down her cheek, but for the first time, her eyes hold a flicker of hope. I push a legal pad and a pen across the desk toward her. "Now," I say, my voice shifting, becoming the calm, capable voice of a leader. "Let's plan your operation." And that's where my story finds its new beginning. It started on that cold kitchen floor, feeling broken and alone, but it didn't end there. It ended here with a new mission and a chosen family. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you believe that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths, please hit that like button. Subscribe to become part of a community built on resilience and support. You never know who in your life needs to hear that they aren't alone, so please consider sharing this story. Finally, let's start a roll call of strength in the comments below. Just type the word legacy to honor the future that we all have the power to build for ourselves. Stay strong and know your unit is out there.